Time to start the second panel of today's Prague European Summit, and it's my pleasure to welcome here a new set of speakers, new set of experts, and also the moderator of this panel discussion, Markéta Boubínová from DAY1, who will guide you through this panel discussion about the EU neighbourhood policy and the diplomatic efforts amid the war in Ukraine. So, Markéta, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Hello, welcome to our plenary panel discussion. As Aneta said, it's reinvigorating the EU's neighborhood policy and diplomatic efforts amid the war in Ukraine. I would like to introduce maybe closer our speakers is Ms. Eva Horelová. She's a head of a political section and deputy head of the European Commission representation to the Czech Republic. Then we have Mr. Štěpán Černý to my left, who is Director General of the Section for European Affairs in the Office of the Government of the Czech Republic. Then we have Mr. Thomas Gomer, who is Director of the French Institute of International Relations in Paris, France. As well, if I read it correctly, his current work focuses on Russia, digital governance, and French foreign policy and think tanks. And then we have Mr. Luc van Middelaar, a professor, historian, and political philosopher, and one of the founders of Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, which was actually launched here in Prague during October's 2022 European Political Community Summit, which we will be talking about as well. At the beginning, I would like to give each of use, my dear speakers, approximately 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we'll come with some questions. And as well, if please you have any questions, we have, as Aneta already mentioned, the application slido.com, so please write your question or even more questions there, and at the end I hope we'll come to them. So I'd like to start with Eva, please, 5 minutes, floor is yours.
Thank you, good afternoon everybody. The theme of the conference is reshaping Europe. Well, I think we are already kind of entering dubious grounds because European Union, how do we define it? And well, I think we need to speak about both. It's Europe, but also European Union as a political entity. What is very important for me is that indeed we speak about Europe as a political entity and in that regard mentioning also the European citizenship. We do need for reshaping Europe not just the political will and political imagination, but we need the citizens for that as well. And there already, I would dare say that we have a kind of manco because we have very little interest in most of the European Union countries into the foreign policy, into reshaping Europe and into how we work with abroad. Reshaping, but reshaping by whom? You know, I've already mentioned the citizens, but the politicians to whom the citizens are giving the power to actually do something are integral part to all of this. What are the signposts for me as we are looking ahead? The big signpost is definitely European Parliament elections in June 2024. In the meantime, the politicians are also working at the European Union level on the so-called strategic agenda for the European Union 2024-2029, and the citizens will give the power to the politicians through the European Parliament elections to, hand in hand with the member states, shape the next European Commission. And this next European Commission, as of late 2024, will be essential in putting together and implementing, reshaping Europe, what we are having now in some trends, but then it will be a kind of a political decision for the future. Again, in the line of by whom, I mentioned the citizens giving the power to the politicians, but of course then who is then really reshaping Europe and working with the neighborhood? It's the journalists, it's the experts, it's the business people, but I will also really underline the role of the EU delegations abroad. I'm sometimes kind of checking the audience to whom I speak to. You know, how many member states are there in the United Nations? So maybe I will check you, Markéta. How many?
How many nations?
Yeah, how many countries are there in the United Nations?
How many countries in the United Nations? I'd say like 170.
It's 193. And in how many of these do you think are there European Union delegations?
Well, I mean like European Union countries, like 27 or?
No, abroad. So abroad, outside the European Union, there are about 140 European Union delegations. And you could probably kind of guess where they are not. We don't really have, no longer, by the way, an EU delegation to Vanuatu. But we do have EU delegations in all our neighborhood and farther afar. So it is also essential the work of these people, hand in hand again with the member states' embassies on the ground. But these are the people who are also implementing and making happen these European Union policies and working with the third countries. And because we have many young people in the audience, or youngish looking people, and we do have the European young leaders of the European and the Prague European Summit program, I would also underline the internship possibilities in these EU delegations, or even the professional future possibilities. So not only for those who are interested in diplomacy or legal issues, we at the EU delegations are also working on the project management, be it digital transition, green transition, the trade, as was the topic of our past panel. So this is quite a chance for you to kind of actively influence what is happening. Well, we are supposed to be speaking about the European neighborhood. We still have a kind of umbrella policy, European neighborhood policy, but that is essentially, I would say, kind of an overcome status, overcome tool, although many of the tools are still in place. So we are now mostly in the neighborhood looking to the south, so the Mediterranean neighborhood, which includes also the Levant with all the many tragic events happening right now. But we are also having the eastern part of the European neighborhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, but there are also, it has been mostly in the past 1.5 year overcome by the enlargement policies for the Western Balkans. But neighborhood for Europe is much broader. We also need to go and look to the north and, for example, into the Arctic Council and the Arctic policies. In the West, the neighborhood, we may kind of have Iceland on the map in our head, but the very broad neighborhood across the pond, across the Atlantic Council, is quite essential as well. The US primarily, but also Canada. And these countries are quite important for our work with the neighborhood countries of Europe, because we do work with them very often hand in hand. And their active policies in our European neighborhood is very often indispensable, because we would not be able to do it alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Now I'd like to give the floor for his 5 minutes remark to Luc.
Thank you, Marketa. I think under the heading Re-invigorating the EU's neighbourhood policy, I think this reinvigoration, if that is a word, has been above and foremost been the doing of Vladimir Putin. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the whole strategic situation and all the relations between the European Union and its neighbors. And that's why it's a good moment to discuss this. I think there's one fundamental change with the war, is that in the overall organization of the European continent, as we had it before, there is now no longer a space for gray zones or in-between zones, in between Russia on the one hand and the rest of Europe or the West on the other hand. Whereas, well, let's say in the 1990s or early 2000s, a country like Ukraine is a prime example of a country which was in between. It was maybe not very comfortable position always, but it also had some advantages in those days. But today this is no longer viable. And today there is a harsh, stark dividing line cutting across the continent with Russia and Belarus on one hand and almost all other European nations on the other hand. And that's a historic change. And we see that with NATO, with the European political community and the EU. NATO, I'm going to be very short. But there, the very visible fundamental change is that countries which were neutral or non-aligned for a very, very long time, Finland, 70 years, Sweden, 2 centuries, they decided to join the military alliance because they feel that in the world of today they can no longer be non-aligned. But I think you asked Marketa also about the European political community. This is also a response to this new situation, and a very interesting response, indeed launched here in Prague, at Prague Castle. But maybe not everybody in the audience precisely remembers. This was a gathering last year here in Prague. There have been 2 more summits since, of 40 or a bit over 40 leaders from across Europe. Not only 27 EU presidents or prime ministers, but also, for instance, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was there. Here in Prague last year, it was Liz Truss, a very short-lived Prime Minister. In fact, she did only 2 things. One was burying the Queen, and the other thing was attending the European Political Community Summit. But also the President of Turkey came, the Prime Ministers of Norway and Switzerland, which are, of course, always also outside the EU, plus the leaders of the Western Balkans. And why did these leaders outside the EU enjoy this forum? Also those of, let's say, candidate countries. Precisely because it was not about the EU. I think Stepan Czerny can confirm, but it was very important to have no European flags, EU flags in the room, because it was not about the EU. This was about something older, more fundamental. It was about Europe as a continent. And Europe as a continent, even if we have the EU, but it still exists in a way, also politically, in these moments of war and peace, when leaders feel, okay, we need to get together to discuss what we share, what our security interests. Should we reorganize a little bit the continent? Think about, for the historians among you, the Vienna Congress, 1814-15, after the Napoleonic Wars, or even earlier, 1648. This was not at the same scale, but it's a little bit, and Thomas Gomard will maybe share that view. It's a little bit that moment of continental readjustment. And it was important, therefore, that in this European political community, which the Czech Republic's Prime Minister Fiala chaired, it was a meeting of equals. It's not about being in or outside the EU, or being a candidate, or an ex-member, a divorcee of the club like the United Kingdom. No, they're all sovereign European states. They were meeting at level of leaders, and without declarations, without bureaucracy, without preparations, which made it also a light format fitting for that occasion. So that's on the APC, and I will say just 2 sentences on the European Union. We can discuss that later, but I think the fundamental change for the European Union in this new situation after Russia's invasion is that the EU wholeheartedly opened the door to Ukraine and Moldova to become EU members, which of course the Ukrainians wanted, at least since the Maidan Revolution. But it was not on the cards before Putin's invasion. In June 2022, the EU leaders unanimously took this decision, and it will never be withdrawn. So that is a new principle of EU's engagement with one of its most important neighbors, with Turkey and the UK, which is Ukraine, to bring it on also in the long term on this side of this continental dividing line, not only, let's say, more short term, like in the EPC, where President Zelensky has participated, but also as a member of the European Union. And that brings a lot of changes, has a lot of repercussions also on the EU internally. We can discuss that, but it is a fundamental change starting on that horrible morning, in a way, of the 24th of February last year.
Thank you, Luc. Stepan, we've just heard about European political community. You were one of the organizers as a state officer, so I mean really like the official organization of that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much also for the very interesting topic. I can dwell for ages on the European political community, how we made it living in 2 months' time, basically, which included the month of August, which usually in Brussels is consumed by holidays. So I think remarkable success in terms of logistics and organization. The political longevity of the European political community is, of course, to be tested by the future chairs. We had a meeting in Granada earlier in October. That means that obviously it's still the leaders, and by leaders I don't mean only the EU27, but also the others, still think it's a viable venue to attend. Then again, of course, the question is being asked, what are the tangible outcomes after 3 summits? And then it becomes a bit more difficult because, well, expectation, of course, within the, maybe not that much within the cynical think tankers, but within the less cynical journalists, is that, oh, European political community will produce a lot of good, and then people will be richer and happier and nicer, environment will be cleaner, and people will be safer, which is obviously not true, because it's a meeting of political leaders which does not have these outcomes. But still, I understand that by the end of the day, to have a longer and better motivation of leaders to attend, to spend their time and the per diems on travel to go to Granada or Chisinau or elsewhere, more tangible outcomes will be required. But coming back for the European neighbourhood policy, I think Eva described it quite well, that it's I was a bit surprised that this topic is still being used, because I think it fell out of fashion sometime around 2013 when we've actually understood in the EU that all countries which are not within the EU are different. In one way, Europe knows where it ends. Geographically, we have the European continent. In the treaties, it says quite clearly that you can be member of the EU if you're on the European continent. You cannot be member of the EU if you're Morocco or the United States or Vanuatu, to use a very distant example. On the other hand, when European neighbourhood policy was a topic of the day, there was a quite understanding between the EU members, but also the countries which are not in the EU, that there are some European countries which do not want to become members of the EU in the foreseeable future. One of them being Ukraine, second being Moldova, then Georgia, then maybe Kosovo. Well, nobody would ever thought it sincerely back in 2007-8 that Kosovo was not independent by then and would not become member of the EU. Yet we are in a reality, I think both of you described it quite well, that now we have a quite well-established dividing line between everything on the European continent and Russia and their satellite Belarus. That all which is not Russia and Belarus want to cooperate, want to work together, want to align their strategic values and their values with the European community. If they want to be a member or not, that's maybe a different question, but I think that right now, what's also remarkable, that almost all the countries on the European continent somehow want to become either member of the EU or have a very intense working relationship with the EU, or are Armenia and Azerbaijan. Of course, I think their way to the EU is quite long, but still these are countries at war with each other, so I understand that they're probably not thinking about EU membership next year or the year after. So I think that's very, 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 very important to understand that now the war in Ukraine changed everything, changed all our lives, changed all our policy making, changed the whole outlook of the EU, and put a new emphasis on the enlargement policy, which is a very good policy for stabilizing the whole region. I think, well, most of people in the audience were maybe born when we were already a candidate for the EU, not me, but so you don't remember how it was when we were negotiating accession to the EU. It took quite long, and I think it will also take quite long for Ukraine and Moldova. We've somehow forgotten Bosnia, but I see the ambassadors for Bosnian membership to the EU also within the audience, so let's not forget that there is still Western Balkans too, who wants to eventually become member of the EU, and it also, their conviction is quite sincere, I think. So yeah, so this is my statement.
Thank you very much, Thomas. You might maybe give us a bit of a French point of view, especially maybe towards the enlargement policy, since for France, for Emmanuel Macron, it's a big topic, and as well the European political community was kind of like his child, as I understand correctly. So please, 5 minutes for your remark.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your invitation. Many things have been said. I'm very happy to participate in this discussion. I have 3 brief points to make for these 5 minutes. The very first one is a sort of quick historical reminder. Since, the Treaty of Roma in 1957, there were different waves of enlargement. And one of them, very important, was 1973 with the accession of the UK. And we'll be back to the Brexit because I think it's something highly important. And 40 years after, in 2013, we had the accession of Croatia. Why I mentioned that? It is maybe we have forgotten, unfortunately, that to end up the Balkans war, there was a perspective of adhesion. So Croatia joined, but just before coming, I passed in front of the embassy of Serbia, for instance, and there are still Balkans countries which are out, with also a particular political evolution, to say nothing about Serbia. And it's very important to have that in mind. To conclude, to finish the war in Balkans, there was a perspective of the EU accession. And we had Brexit. And I think that we should think about the roots of the Brexit, which are very serious. You have mentioned rightly citizenship. But you have some voters, you have some people in the opinion, we are not comfortable with the European project in some part of Europe as it is led. So that's my first point. Even if, of course, I do think that the Brexit was an historical mistake for the UK, but the thing is they decided to leave from continental Europe. My second point is about the so-called neighbourhood policy made by the EU. It is interesting to note that after the last big enlargement in 2004, there was ambition of the EU to promote the neighbourhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, which was targeting 6 countries, so Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And now we have 6 conflicts. So this policy should be questioned. Because at that time, the EU pretends not to be geopolitical, say nothing about geopolitics. And now the EU, the Commission, more precisely, pretends to be geopolitical. And that leads me to the big question. It is to know whether it is really the future for the EU to be geopolitical and to pretend that Europe will play the same game than the US, China, or Turkey and Russia. I think it's a dangerous illusion. Because geopolitics is related to the use of force. And the EU was not created in this perspective. So as long as we speak about geopolitics for the EU, without taking into consideration NATO, I think it is misleading and dangerous. Because we are not integrated, and you can just observe, the respective position. You have mentioned Kosovo. We are divided on Kosovo, for instance. We are divided on the war between Hamas and Israel. So let's be very careful with, and as you said, I'm coming from Paris, so let's be very careful with this notion of, a geopolitical EU. If we succeed in being, a geo-economic union, it will be not so bad. Last point, yes, I agree with my 3 colleagues to say that the war in Ukraine is a rupture. It's not a rupture in February 2022, it's a rupture in February 2014. I should have also mentioned, related to my second point, that we had this Eastern Partnership, and simultaneously we had an attempt for the Union pour la Méditerranée, which was also unsuccessful. Have a look about the war in Syria and its consequences, regional consequences, deep consequences for the European continent. So to some extent, geopolitically, Europeans were not very successful during the last 2 decades, to be honest. So that's why I think that speaking about geopolitics should be related to being very careful. Coming back to my final point, yes, it's a rupture which was underestimated in 2014. Annexation of Crimea, destabilization of Donbass, for different reasons we can speak about. And because of that, the EU lost its main competitive advantage, which was its strategic stability. at the global level. We are no more seen from the outside as a stable continent, which is true, unfortunately, for all of us. And that leads me to the real, I think, and difficult question we should face very seriously and carefully. It is, let's imagine a situation. I'm not sure it will happen, fortunately, but let's imagine that, you know, Donald Trump is re-elected in November 2024. And that's, he said what he said for North Korea, that he will solve the problem in 24 hours. Decide to reduce the US support to Ukraine, maybe to stop it, even if it's much more complicated to be implemented, as you know. But imagine that. What would be our reaction as Europeans? That will be the real test for us. Are we able by ourselves to continue to support Ukraine?
Thank you. And let's actually continue with the situation you imagine, because it really interests me. So you said that the EU, Thomas, shouldn't pretend, or the European Commission, to be geopolitical, rather to play a role of geoeconomical player, if I understand it correctly. So what can we imagine under it, and what can happen in that situation that Donald Trump is re-elected, and then he is withdrawing the support for Ukraine? He might be even like make the US leave NATO. So then we do not have the NATO role in the geopolitical play here around. So how do you mean it actually, and how could be it seen in the neighborhood policy? I mean, EU neighborhood policy.
Well, the basic question for Europeans is the following, in my opinion. You know, are we able to secure by ourselves our neighborhood, broadly speaking? My personal answer at this stage is unfortunately no. So we should not, you know, fuel an illusion to pretend to be able to do so. We are not. We are not for different reasons, because that's not the object, you know, of the EU. But it's not its DNA. And secondly, something much more difficult to accept, it is the fact that Europeans started, you know, their disarmament 2 generations ago. We started to disarm in Europe at the beginning of the 70s. Okay, we were approximately around 3% of GDP for our military spending at that time. And we continue to do so after 11 September. Whereas other actors, namely, of course, the US, China, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, started their rearmament. So the real rupture, in a sense, was made, you know, by, yes, indeed, by, I don't know if European EPC is important or Macron child. I think it's a secondary issue. The real issue is his decision to restart the military spending in 2017. And the fact is that other Europeans decided to do so with the war in Ukraine, but the problem is that you are never able, you know, to recover many decades of disarmament in a period of huge crisis, and that's the problem we are all facing.
So maybe I'll ask Luc, so do you think that the European political community can play a big role in this situation, or maybe as well in our neighborhood policy? Actually, our neighborhood or our neighbors in Europe are members or should be members, even though, for example, here now in Granada, in the summit we recently had, we didn't have the Turkish president and the Armenian president, which was seen, especially from us journalists, as a grave problem. So how do you feel it? Is it geopolitical player as well, or just geoeconomical player, and how does it look for the neighborhood policy?
Well, I think the European political community, which indeed has had 3 summits, is a meeting space and has proved useful as a meeting space for leaders in a very uncertain moment right after the war and the invasion. And it will no doubt continue to play that role for a while. I think it's important to notice that the next summit will not be just anywhere, but it will be held in London. And in fact, the United Kingdom, ex-EU member obviously, was very keen to host the summit, because they also understand that it's important for them to still belong to the wider European family, or of those states who share a continent and who have certain security interests in common. I think the EPC will continue to function for a while, but I fully agree with Thomas Gomard. Clearly, this is not the forum to deal with the much more fundamental issues of security of all European nations, including Czechia and others, when it comes to defending our territory, for instance, against Russia or another context. For that, there is today NATO, but as long as more than 50% of military spending in NATO is US or US and Canada together, it means that we as Europeans, for whom NATO was designed, are not very serious. And in this respect, indeed, there are perhaps more important elections than the European elections, with all due respect for the European elections, which are the American elections when we talk about the strategic fundamental decisions. Here, I would say that the way the European Union has to go to become a more credible actor in terms of speaking the language of power is a long road, and I agree with that Thomas Gomard just said. And one reason I, with some colleagues, founded the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics is precisely to say that, listen, ladies and gentlemen, it's not like you take an adjective from your rhetorical toolkit and you say, I'm a geopolitical commission, that it's done the next day. Because it is completely, and I don't want to underestimate this, at odds with what the European Union has historically achieved, which was to do exactly the opposite of doing geopolitics. Because, well, if you want to summarize very rapidly, geopolitics, somehow it's about power, it's about thinking in terms of territory, and also maybe in terms of collective identity to some extent. If you look at Turkish, Chinese, Russian, American leaders, they have all these three. EU was supposed to do away with power, it was supposed to do away with borders and thinking in terms of territories, and also is not so good at expressing, let's say, a story or a narrative about our identity which is not either national or universal, to sum it up very succinctly, and I apologize. So there's a long way to go, but I think we are in a period of deep historic change, and there is also space. There's change in the world around us, but there's also space for political decision-making and determination to put certain steps on that road for Europe and European nations collectively to be more credible. I think in the short term, and I'll stop there, when it comes to really the security side of the story, it will have to be a European pillar within NATO rather than EU. With a view to this November 2024 election. But the European Union, as one of the most, if not the most important political organization on the continent, also has a role to play to foster a more shared understanding of our not only economic, but also of our strategic interest. And final sentence, the EPC, it's the European political community, is not the decisive actor here, but it can play a role because it helps European nations to remember an older kind of diplomacy, which is really about interest and security and war and peace, which sometimes within the EU, which is overly bureaucratized, they forget about, and which we will desperately need when it is about dealing with the big animals in the world outside.
Thank you. We've heard, Stepan, a lot about power and geopolitics, and as we know, this European Commission calls itself the Geopolitical European Commission. How do you see that in times when we have such a grave conflict, and well, that's the one in Ukraine, but then we have more conflicts in the neighborhood, as like Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example. So do you think that the EU should play the geopolitical role, or must play the geopolitical role in the neighborhood, or is it more geo-economical role, or the role of mere security?
Well, I think the EU has no other choice than to secure its immediate neighborhood. That's basically if it stands any chance of continuing as an entity, as a subject of international relations, which I guess it somehow intends to. Of course, the Commission calling itself Geopolitical Commission, as has been said, does not end with that. Somehow the Commission should maybe talk to the Member States whether they are willing to give the resources and the powers and the competences to the Commission to call itself Geopolitical Commission, which I think not a single one of the Member States are currently willing. I don't really see that the Member States who have their militaries and their nuclear weapons and their other kinds of weapons and their intelligence services and their other tools of security, of making their country secure, are willing to even share this information among each other, not even thinking about sharing these tools with the European Commission, God forbid. Before this debate is undertaken on leaders level and leaders show commitment, I think there's no chance of a geopolitical commission. Yes, we have the External Action Service, we have a high representative. I hope some people here know his name, know what kind of deals are being done with this position when it's been established, and whether we really put the most skilled people in this place. I don't know. I don't somehow think so. And with all due respect to Mr. Borrell and his illustrious political career, I don't really think that he's taking as serious as other ministers of foreign affairs of global superpowers. And that's also part of the issue. I will not really touch upon the very comical relations between the President of the European Commission and President of the European Council, but still, if we are to be taken serious, we should probably avoid situations when the two are competing for a seat in Erdogan's palace. It's anecdotal, but still it's somehow relevant that we have two or maybe even more presidents of the European Union. And these institutional hurdles may seem comical, and then, but then again, everybody knows which phone to call in the White House and in the Kremlin and in whatever palace the Chinese president is currently residing. And if you call Charles Michel, Ursula von der Leyen and Mr. Borrell, do you get the same answer? If you call Elysee Palace, probably not even in that direction. So I think that it's a serious debate we have to make. I don't really think that the procedural debate about moving from unanimity to qualified majority in foreign and security policy is relevant at all, because if we don't have this convergence of strategic cultures, which is an abstract concept, but in reality it means that all the 27 consider the threats as being the same. And do all the 27 consider the threats being the same? I don't think at all. And I'm not talking about Hungary. I'm talking about whether do countries which border the Mediterranean consider the threats from the east in the same intensity as we do? Whether the countries who border Russia think that any sort of internal crisis in Latin America is really relevant? I don't really think so. And this is the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves before engaging in a rhetorical exercise. Of course, EU has to be more resilient and more engaged and more united and more geopolitical, but without these steps, this will be just plain rhetorics, and that's one calling we will be giving as member states to the future European Commission to maybe start from there.
Thank you. Yes, but we don't have anything else, so we do have to have a strong European Union. And we right now have many states, or there are states who are really trying to be members. And we recently have the enlargement package from the European Commission, which is recommending to open the accession talks with 2 new members, and with some conditions with the third one. First is Ukraine and Moldova, and then the third, Bosnia. So, Eva, how do you read that decision of the Commission to recommend to open the negotiations, the accession negotiations with those countries?
Well, I would like to really underline that the power of the Union is with the member states. So indeed, we do have a political leadership of the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. but the underlying power lies with the member states. If the member states' politicians, based on the choice of the citizens, do not agree or lead the European power on the global stage, we are going nowhere. And we are not for the first time in the past decades facing really dramatic change on the European continent, a security one, but we also do have a window of opportunity to move forward towards becoming a geopolitical European Union. I do agree with all the challenges, but I still would rather say we need to discuss what are also the faults and pities and dangers and risks if we are not moving ahead into the direction. Enlargement policy is, again, the European Commission is acting upon the guidance and request of the European member states from the European Council. So the European Commission got a certain task to review, based on merits, the progress and efforts of the countries which are requesting or having the ambition to join the European Union. And now it will be upon the member states in the European Council, in the Council of the EU, to decide on that. What is essential in assessing the country's readiness and ambition is especially the political and economic criteria, but it really goes down to the rule of law. Because a rule of law is the basics for the functioning political environment and democracy, but also for this European single market. Because if you do not have a rule of law, if you do not have companies coming to the EU or operating on the EU internal market, having trust in functioning country, also, you know, without corruption, etc., and having the court's decision really enforceable, then also the economy will falter. What is important to stress with this debate about geopolitical union or not in this last so-called enlargement package published by the European Commission is that the Commission puts a lot more stress on the so-called CFSP alignment. CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy. Maybe a little historical window. Indeed, the European Union or European Community in the past 6-7 decades, regarding external policies, it did start as a development agency. It was a kind of, you know, the goody buddy going around the world in the ECP countries to start with. And then with the subsequent enlargement of the Union itself, with the new members, also the foreign policy, external policy was changing. So with the 80s enlargement for Latin American, for Spain and Portugal, we started opening delegations in the Latin American continent, etc. And Thomas already mentioned the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s. That was the push, external push for the EU member states back then to actually establish this CFSP policy, Common Foreign and Security Policy. So in a way, we are, in historical terms, very young as a foreign policy actor, and it still is a mostly intergovernmental policy, first and foremost regarding security, intelligence cooperation, military cooperation. At the same time, there are really milestones happening on the EU level in cooperating much more with the European Defence Agency. We have this DIRPA tool for joint public procurement, and yes, it is extremely difficult, and yes, we are facing the issue of having different histories, very different interests, but we will somehow need to converge, because we are facing at least a very aggressive neighbor in the east, that is the Russian Federation. I don't think anybody in this room or, you know, other analysts could say that the whole thing changed. We have no longer business as usual, and this issue is there going to be for decades. Yes, anything can happen anytime. I'm also usually telling the students when I'm talking to them, listen, I was born in the Eastern Bloc in the late 70s in a country that doesn't exist anymore. And a few years ago, I was posted in the US as the deputy spokesperson of the European Union delegation. So in 1989, my parents would definitely not think that, you know, this is a professional path for me. So things can be changing. It is also extremely important for us inside the European Union, among the member states, but also experts, to be speaking much more about the various scenario analysis. And I feel that at least in the institutions, there is a lot of hesitance to really engage and lead this scenario analysis, but we do need it. I was, for example, for 4 years covering the EU response to the war in Syria, and I dare say maybe we could have omitted some mistakes if we were able to do much more open and more credible scenario analysis of what may be happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. We have many questions already from the audience, which surprises me. Some of them even with some likes. So I maybe will start with some of them. The one which has already likes is, what about the integration of Turkey in the EU? Would it be possible in the near future? So if anybody, if you wants to react, so...
I'm not sure whether I should jump in because I had spent 3 years in Ankara with a posting at the European Union delegation as the head of political reporting. And that's probably also why I really wanted to underline the work of these EU delegations and, you know, hand in hand in the so-called Team Europe with the member states' embassies in the third countries. Because the delegation is actually writing the first draft of this enlargement report. And then the draft goes to the headquarters in Brussels, to the consultations inside the Commission, and, you know, some side consultations with the member states. Well, we have been always saying that we would wish that Turkey or Turkey is not, you know, is getting closer to us, but not farther away from us. But what Turkey has clearly taken as a direction in the past decade, for example, especially in the past decade, especially with the change of the constitution and launch of the so-called executive presidency in their political system, that's clearly not in line with the political criteria which we are having in place. And the report of the European Commission is quite clearly stating that. In late November, you may be kind of looking forward to the Commission and the High Representative report to the European Council that will put into the place some areas of, kind of summing up the state of play where we are on EU-Turkey relations, but also again putting on the table some alternatives how to engage, because we also do not have the luxury not to engage in the EU-Turkey relationship. And we are engaging on the trade issues, on climate issues, so in many, many areas, but the possible enlargement negotiations has been really in the freezer for many years now.
Thank you. Then there is a special question for Luc. Wouldn't the absence of a veto, we've already heard about a veto, of a veto in foreign or neighborhood policy help the EU to be a strong player in global play, I guess?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. On the one hand, it seems to make good sense if you abolish a veto, especially if you're a club of 27, which means that any single member of these 27 can say no, and then the community or the group as a whole cannot act. It is a risky situation of one member state taking others hostage. There have been examples of that as well. On the other hand, I personally do not think that abolishing a veto is a kind of panacea for solving some of the European Union's fundamental issues, which are of a different nature. And also because when you say veto, I mean, it sounds as if it's something very bad. But the other side of the medal is that veto means unanimity. And it means that we take decisions which all member states, and which, as Eva said, are in charge of these fundamental matters, agree with. And when it's about issues which are really close to identity, history, culture, matters of war and peace are always in that category, it is of course important that everybody agrees with fundamental decisions. And Therefore, I think there can be instances where some of, let's say, more or less symbolically important vetoes could maybe be abolished to avoid this kind of hostage taking of one member state, which is really to the detriment of all, and where sometimes the veto playing is not even linked to the issue at stake. But I think where we are, and for these really important issues, it is important that all ministers or all leaders agree with these key decisions, also so that when they go home, so to say, when they go to they have had a meeting in Brussels and then they go to Prague or to Helsinki or to Lisbon, they cannot say, well, it was just a Brussels meeting, I've been outvoted and I'm not even going to apply the decision or uphold the decision which we have taken. But it means that they are politically bound by that decision, and that they can also be held accountable to it. And I think that is an important function of this rule of unanimity, which I can reassure those who joined the European Union or their member state in 2004 and later, which was already hotly debated in the 1960s between France and the Netherlands and Belgium. So this veto issue has always been a very powerful, symbolic and political issue, has often been divisive, will not go away, for reasons which are fundamental.
Thank you. I'd still like to pose one question towards our topic, because the questions we have here, some of them are not really concerning the neighborhood policy, though I'll come back to them. I have a question for Thomas, and it's more, again, about the conflicts which we have in some regions in the neighborhood. So what do you think should be the role the EU should play in them, maybe as well from the political point of view?
Well, it's a difficult question, because it's the level of degree we are ready to accept to solve a conflict. It's not always possible to solve a conflict, diplomatically, as is often said, unfortunately. So I have no general answer to this question. Maybe a way to respond in unfortunately quite pessimistic way. It is, when you read, for instance, the last paper, The Strategic Compass, which is a good paper in my opinion, interesting in its vision. But when you arrive at the end, it is said that the EU should be able to deploy 5,000 troops. Are you serious? We are not. I remember in 2002 there was the so-called Helsinki goals, and at that time we were supposed to be able to deploy 60,000 troops. So if we think that we will be able, to resolve conflicts with this sort of military means, we are mistaken.
Thank you. It was indeed a difficult question, though I still would like to hear some answers to it. So, Luc, for example, what do you think should be the role of the EU in the regional conflicts in the neighborhood?
Well, I mean, I do not have to add so much to what Thomas already said, but there clearly is a role for the EU to try with others to negotiate and broker a kind of ideally peace, or at least an understanding, for instance, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which one EU actor, the President of the European Council, tried, and he used also, we discussed earlier, the European Political Community format to get these leaders together with the French President, German Chancellor, to bring them around the table. Unfortunately, this was not followed up in Grenada, as you mentioned, Marketa, but clearly there, the EU, which in this case of hard power always has to mean the EU as in EU institutions plus leaders from a few large member states. That's how it is, and that is also Europe in my view. I have no scruples when it comes to that. That is one example. I don't know whether you want to discuss the situation in Belarus or in the Western Balkans, where also historically the EU has also played a role, even if the Americans at the time did, of course, the heavy work, but the EU has then played a role with certain missions. Well, Eva will know more about it: police missions or observer missions, etc. So there is definitely work to do, which to some extent, other regional organizations can do. But there used to be the OSCE, but it is in a bad shape because Russia is still a member. So it's a little bit lost a bit of its vigor, to the extent it still had that vigor. So there's NATO, but in some conflicts, NATO is seen as a part of the conflict. So the EU can still be an actor.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to the questions from the audience. The most popular one doesn't have to do much with the neighborhood policy, still I'll pose it to Stepan, who actually mentioned already the President of the European Council, Charles Michel. Should we abolish the international role of the President of the European Council in general?
How would we do that? Will we prevent him or her from traveling? Of course, I think that the precise institutional setup we have right now was the deliberate decision by the member states back in, what was that, 2007, that we want to have the two posts of the two presidents separate, so that there's someone to steer the work of the European Council and then someone more of a CEO of the European Commission who has much more to do than only to steer the work of the European Council. I think that in the treaties we confer a sort of role to the President of the European Council. I'm not exactly sure that because we've only had 3 examples of them out of 2 who were former Belgian prime ministers, which is a good thing in one way, which is maybe not that much good thing in another way. But sorry for that. but in a way, I think the member states should think more about the kind of competence profile they should be given to the President of the European Council. And so once the decision is made, not to complain about that too much. Of course. In the strict sense, the role is procedural to steer the work between the 4 European councils we have every year, and not to present himself or herself as the president of Europe, which I'm not accusing Charles Michel of doing so, but still the fact that we are still missing the one phone number probably will be extremely difficult to resolve within the institutional setup we have right now. If we opt for European Federation, which some members of the European Parliament and some members of the Czech government are arguing for, that would definitely change the ways. But let's see what kind of democratic mandate will the voters give in elections next year for that.
Yes, Luc, please.
Yeah, just a brief additional comment, which I'm not making because I worked for another former prime minister who was president of the European Council for 5 years, who was Herman van Rompuy, as a member of his team, and where indeed it was a different situation, and that president used most of his energy internally to bring all member states online when it came in particular to the financial and economic and euro crisis. But I wanted actually to make a more analytical point, which is related to this issue of external representation. And it has to do with the change of era in the way we are living in, and with the issue of geopolitics as well. Because there are no doubt many EU legal experts in the room. And of course, the Lisbon Treaty, which invented this dual external representation with the President of the European Council on one hand and the President of the Commission on the other hand, was written for a different world. It was written in a different era, 20 years ago. It was written for a world in which the cleverest people back then thought we could separate, on the one hand, foreign affairs, classic foreign affairs, issue for the member states. Think about the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, Middle East peace process, these kind of things. That was, in a way, entrusted or mandated to European Council President. And on the other hand, we would have trade, economic relations, economic external relations, which is closer, as Eva can confirm, to also historically to the work of the European Commission. So you have security on the one hand and economy on the other hand, to put it simply, with two external representations. What could be easier than that? Well, the fact is that the world has changed, and that today the most important, the most difficult decisions, and Thomas will confirm, are, for instance, about precisely where these two worlds come together. They are about economic security. They are about how do we deal with China as an economic partner, where we have important export-import relations, but which is also at the same time, to some extent, a security threat, where we have to reflect. And we have taken a very clear decision in bringing down our energy dependence on Russia. But there was a mix of energy and security considerations. So the world has changed, and the, let's say, the diplomatic and institutional setup of the EU has not changed with it, because it always takes more time. But I think this indeed invites us collectively to think, okay, how can we make the European Union more fit for an age in which economy and security are no longer separated? I'm not going to give an answer because you're going to ask me, because I think but first we have to agree on the analysis, and the analysis is this was made for another age, and we are in a new age. So I do not only blame, of course, personalities always play a role. It's not that they couldn't have done a better job. I think they could have and they should have than von der Leyen and Michel do when it comes to their cooperation. But it's also more difficult for them than it was 10 or 15 years ago, with the kind of issues they are dealing with.
Thomas, we've heard that the Lisbon Treaty was made for another world, for a different world. On the other hand, to have a new treaty, is it even possible to imagine that? Even with the Lisbon Treaty, it was really difficult to get it through. We would have to have in some countries even referendums. So could you realistically imagine to open the treaties and to go again through that whole process, which actually ended with the signature of the Czech president here in Prague, but which was really difficult in few countries. So do you think there is a possibility to have something else than the Lisbon Treaty?
Frankly speaking, I don't know. What can I say? It is that, in 2005, I remember pretty well, because I started in the think tank industry. So there was a double rejection of the EU treaty by the Netherlands and France. And at that time, we were very active to develop the relation between the EU and Russia. And I remember pretty well I've been told by my Russian colleagues, your votation is the end of the EU. Because Vox Populi, Vox Dei, which is very funny when I have a Russian colleague explain to you democracy. And to some extent, if you continue in this way, you will have a dysfunctional EU. So in their perspective, it's interesting because it was confirmed in a sense, by the Brexit. So you have this expectation, made in Russia since almost 20 years that the EU is by its nature, because of this rejection, after what was made to adopt, the Lisbon Treaty, dysfunctional. Second point, if you read, that's something I made recently, if you read the Lisbon Strategy, it should have been, 2009, you are faced a big paradox, which is uncomfortable for all of us, The more Europe has enlarged, the less it is global. And that's something on which we should be very, very, very careful once again, because there is a loss of European competitivity, which is more and more visible, especially in relation with the US. Our economy are in very difficult terms by comparison with the US one. So the gap between the US and Europe has increased dramatically, and also the gaps in terms of economic development within the EU, to say nothing of the relation between Germany and France, for instance. That's why if we try to be focused on what can be done, and if you take my points, you see that I am very careful with this idea of being geopolitical, because for me it is related to the use of force. So that's why we should be very careful. And that's why I'm more comfortable in trying to say where it's possible to create consensus, to have a real impact in terms of competitivity, in terms of improving our security or economic security. I see three fields. The very first one is space activity, and in particular to keep and to improve our access to space. That's something which was done by Europeans in the past. We can continue to be done with adaptation, but if we fail on that, there will be, believe me, no European security at all. Second, cybersecurity, which is a huge challenge given, the decision taken and the fact that the EU was very, very slow to understand, the digitalization and what was done by the GAFAM. So as long as you are not able, to protect your own data, it's very difficult to be serious in cybersecurity. And last but not least, but that's something very easy, we move swiftly and efficiently in France on that. It is to be maybe more tough with the ESG when it's related to defense activities. I think it's highly important at the European level to say, yes, we should invest on our defense industrial base. And we should be able to say on that, forget for some time, ESG.
Thank you. I'll come back to the questions from the audience. We have 10 more minutes left. Eva, what is the proper way to use EU's neighbourhood policy when Hungary has, let's say, an alternative position?
Well, it's probably rather a broader question of our effectiveness and decision-making, and Luke had been talking, and Thomas a little bit as well, about the unanimity or veto, whether you want to call it more positive way unanimity or more negative way as a veto, in the intergovernmental policy, which is the common foreign and security policy. And indeed, the risk of removing unanimity or veto from the foreign policy is that even if you have then qualified majority voting, we are already now facing some member states who are, let's say, overvoted, and then on the qualified majority voting, and they go home to their capital and saying, well, I don't care, I will go to the European Court of Justice and I'm not going to implement it. So it's a broader systemic problem of indeed one or more member states, once they are members of the family, then you can't do much. The way the treaties are set up, there is very little coercion mechanisms for members of the family. We may have anti-coercion mechanisms for our foreign economic policy, but we don't have that many for us internally. And that's also why the member states, as well as the European Commission in the enlargement process, are so adamant about the rule of law. The rule of law being in place before the countries are potentially becoming members of the Union.
Thank you. Maybe that's a question for Stepan, who works for the government, so who is inside of it all. What role shall the Czech Republic play inside the EU in current multiple crises, Ukraine, Israel, and in the EU's foreign policy in general?
If I want to be cynical, I would say that the best role of Czech foreign policy was to be a bridge between the East, West, and North and South. Usually it's a bridge the foreign armies then walk over, so I don't really think that would be an honest answer. But I think that, well, there's a unique perspective among EU member states that, for instance, you mentioned the Middle Eastern, not peace process, but conflict right now, we have a very, very strong tradition of our ties with Israel. I couldn't spend 2 or 3 hours in a debate why is it so and whether it's reciprocal, for instance. But on the other hand, this is one of the few elements of our domestic and foreign policy. There is actually unanimity within the political class. You can get 200 votes in the chamber in support of Israel. Maybe even the prime minister has to moderate these elements within the political scene. And I think that this is a perspective we can be using within the European Council, for instance, to have a broader range of views. I understand that we are one pole of the debate about our stance towards the Middle Eastern conflict. But I don't really think that the EU is like totally divided vis-a-vis. I think that we've had a set of statements by leaders, by the foreign ministers, and that the fact that some interpret what's within differently domestically, that's the reality of politics. That's the reality of unanimous decision, that you have to come back to your political scene, to your political system, to your political language, and then describe that you took the responsibility and you stand by your decision. So, in a way, coming back to the question of efficient foreign policy making, I don't really think that the procedural debate about QMV veto is the right one. I think that it will be very interesting to see that play academically and to do some analysis how the coalitions may change if we change the voting methods. But in reality, I don't think that to have an efficient policy, if you could get 3 or 4 member states to be constantly overvoted, you don't really have a united foreign policy. And then everybody's talking about Hungarian veto. We're not talking about the Austrian veto enough. I think if we could secure our borders with enlargement of Schengen a couple of months ago, actually a year ago, we could have easily done so. Were it not for Austrian veto, which was purely domestic politic making, we accuse Orbán of being cynical, and I think it's the right thing to do. But nobody has ever accused Nehammer of being equally cynical when it comes to not losing his elections. So just a side note on the, I would say, bit difficult debate about that veto, that there is a veto in the EU, and when we abolish the veto, EU will be paradise on earth.
Thank you. There is a specifically addressed question to Luc. Maybe it's time to beg a question on the table about Europe defense community.
What is the question?
Sorry. Maybe it is time to beg a question on the table about European defense community.
Yeah, I heard the question, but I mean, when we talk about defense, we discussed this earlier, it's not today the EU as such, which is a credible actor to defend even collectively the territory of the member states of the European Union. I think in the short term, this is about NATO, and it will be about organizing the Europeans within NATO, some of whom are in the EU and others are not, like the United Kingdom, which is a very important partner, I think, in NATO. And if one day, which we hope will not happen, but let's say, and the scenario was put on the table earlier, the United States walks out of NATO, this will still need to be the place where, as Europeans, we organize our collective defense. And in parallel, the EU can and should start organizing itself and ourselves better. And as I mentioned, a few initiatives which have more to do with defense industry and public procurement and making sure that we do not have 37 different sizes of ammunition and these kind of issues. But on the military side, it is not the moment to put the European defense community, which has been on the table in the 1950s and was voted off the table by the French Assemblée Générale in 1954, put it back now on the table in 2024.
Thank you. Last question to have the circle full. It's specifically addressed to Thomas. How do you explain that France was wrong with regard to Russia's interests? And we have 3 more minutes left, so it's quite short.
No, it's a little bit difficult for me to conclude on that because it's a very long story. I worked a lot on that on a personal basis, so there are different things which should be said, but in Prague, I think it's important to insist on the statement made by President Macron in Bratislava, you know. That's my answer to this question. Now, another observation. You know, France and Germany were right in 2003 with Russia regarding the intervention made by the UK and the US and the UK and others and other Europeans in Iraq. So it explains a lot to some extent, maybe. And this idea that's why I insist on that, very, very careful on this idea of geopolitics, you know, because this opposition, this diplomatic opposition was not at all successful to change the course of events. Just after, you know, France was very happy to be back to the so-called P3, and it can explain, you know, in my view, the strategic failure of the intervention in Libya. And I can continue on that. So my point is to say we all made some mistakes. I think that my job as a think tanker is to be able to make, you know, a sort of retex on that. And an additional point in to follow up on what was said by Luke, two things. He said very rightly that to some extent US elections are more important for us than the next European elections. And that's a big problem. And second, I'm very skeptical, as you understand, you know, about, you know, this idea of integrated European armed forces. I think it's very far away from us. Having said that, we should and we can really progress for procurement and defense industry. I think that we should be up to 200 billion of military spending, all EU members included. I don't know if the UK is in this figure, maybe the UK is in that. And if we are not able to produce our system, I mean, as soon as you are not able to produce your own weapons, you quit history.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions left. We have a lot of topics to discuss, but unfortunately our time's over. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Eva Horelová, Štěpán Černý, Thomas Gomard, and Luc van Middelaar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, to you.